I'd like to welcome distinguished guests that are located at the front tables as well as throughout the audience, but members of the Allied Transformation Command in Norfolk, the Air Combat Command over at Langley, as well as other guests from Washington, D.C., as well as other places. So I'd like to welcome you here. It's a distinct privilege to welcome you to this sixth presentation of the ARCIC Distinguished Speaker Series. This series invites professional commentators, academics, and others to present on a range of topics that will stimulate professional discussion about the future of armed conflict. This speaker series also fully supports the intent of the Army's Leader Development Program. To operate in a complex environment requires leaders that can perform across the range of military operations. Today's guest speaker is guaranteed to help us think about the future operational environment. Pete Warren Singer is a New York Times best-selling author whose nonfiction books pioneered the study of new fields like private militaries, warlords, drones, and cyber war. Previously, he was a senior fellow and director of the 21st Century Defense Initiative at Brookings Institute. He's been named by CNN to their New Guard list of the next generation of newsmakers, by the Smithsonian Institution National Portrait Gallery as one of the 100 leading innovators in the nation, as one of the 26 people to save the world by Turner Broadcasting, and by Foreign Policy Magazine to their top 100 global thinkers list. Pete Singer works as a consultant for the U.S. Department of Defense and the FBI, and was named by the President to the Transformation Advisory Group, a commission designed to help the U.S. military visualize and plan for the future. We spared no expense for today's event. As a matter of fact, we repaved the parking lot for you out there. We hope that you appreciate it. There was a timing issue, I believe it was related to the continuing resolution, but we certainly invite everybody to the Distinguished Speaker Series today, and I'd like at this time to introduce my boss, Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster.
Hey, thanks, Bo. Commander Mayor Travers and I are really happy to welcome all of you. Thanks especially to those of you who are joining us as our guests from outside our community. We say in the Army operating concept that American military power is joint power, so it's great in particular to see our multinational and joint comrades in arms here today as well. I know you want to hear from Pete Singer, so I want to be super brief here and just tell you that, you know, Ghost Fleet is one of many books that Pete has written that really earned him those accolades and that recognition that Bo mentioned. He is somebody who has a unique ability, I think, to think ahead of where we are. And in Ghost Fleet, the book helps us do that. It is the best of science fiction, because the best of science fiction helps us really imagine the future so we can understand the present and see ourselves better in the decisions we're making. And so I think there's a heck of a lot we're going to learn from his talk. I'm not going to try to foreshadow all of that except to say that I think it's extremely important to our efforts to integrate technologies with our soldiers and teams, and to recognize really that we have to do so consistent with the fundamentals that we've established in the Army operating concept. I'd like to just quote another forward thinker who was tremendous, I think, in understanding, you know, the problem of future armed conflict. Sorry, I left it over here. And that was L.T. Morrison, who wrote a book in 1966 called Men, Machines, and Modern Times. And I think he introduced in that book a theme that comes through in Ghost Fleet. And what Morrison wrote was, he said, we may be caught in the irony that at the very moment when by our wit we have developed the means to give us considerable control over our resistant natural environment, we find we have produced in the means themselves an artificial environment of such complication that we cannot control it. And so the idea is that technology is not the answer. We have to recognize how to integrate technology with skilled soldiers, well-trained teams, adaptive leaders, and we have to also recognize countermeasures to those technological capabilities. So please join me in a warm round of applause and a welcome for Pete Singer.
you for that incredibly kind introduction, and for all of you for coming out. It's an absolute honor to be able to join you here, particularly just the fact of having a book that has a Navy ship on the front of it and being allowed on an Army base for a speech like this. So given we've already broken the mold in one way, we're going to approach this talk a little bit different. We're going to begin with a video, the way you begin most of your talks to your force. It's a video trailer that premiered on Entertainment Weekly. Is how we're going to kick off this talk on the future of war. So, and the folks. Now these visions of US and Chinese warships battling at sea, firing everything from cannons to cruise missiles to lasers, stealthy Russian and American fighter jets dogfighting in the air while robotic drones fly alongside them, hackers in Shanghai and Silicon Valley dueling in digital playgrounds, and fights in outer space determining the winner of battles here on planet Earth. Are they scenes from a novel, or maybe scenes from a war the day after tomorrow? The answer is both. Great power conflict defined the 20th century. We had 2 world wars that cost tens of millions of lives, and the fear of a 3rd world war that shaped everything from the geopolitics of the last half of the 20th century to how we even looked at international sporting competitions. Now, at the start of the 21st century, though, this ever-present fear of World War III seemingly was put in our historic rearview mirror. It isn't that conflict went away, but it was seemingly pushed to other levels. So we stopped worrying about powerful states and worried about failed states. We stopped worrying about highly organized groups along national lines and in more so transnational networks of individuals, everything from insurgents to terrorists to criminals. Indeed, just 4 years ago, the New York Times published an article by a Harvard professor that argued that the era of war between states was over. As it put it, quote, "War really is going out of style," end quote. If only it would. Today, with Russian land grabs in the Ukraine and visits of bombers with red stars painted on their wings, NATO is on its highest levels of alert since the mid-1980s, the height of the Cold War. In the Pacific, the US and a newly powerful, assertive, confident China are engaged in what can only be described as an arms race. China, for example, has built more warships, more warplanes than any other nation in 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015, planning to do so 2016, 2017, you get the picture. And in turn, we're planning to offset them with a new strategy of high technology weapons. The rhetoric is equally heated. For example, Russia's National Security Committee rewrote their defensive doctrine to identify NATO as the, quote, #1 threat to the security of the Russian Federation. In turn, the new chairman of the Joint Chiefs, during his confirmation hearings, told Congress that Russia was the #1 threat to the United States. Maybe both of them should have looked east. After a series of military face-offs over rights of passage in disputed territory near artificial islands, China's official People's Daily newspaper warned, quote, a US-China war is inevitable, end quote, if we didn't change our policies in the Pacific. Now, this may be a little bit of posturing, both for our policymaker audience and an increasingly nationalistic domestic audience in China. For example, a poll by the Perth US Asia Center of around 3,000 Chinese citizens found that 74% of them believe that they would beat you in a war right now. If you did polling among American citizens, you'd probably find the same in reverse. What I'm getting at here is, one, I appreciate all their efforts to help sell my book, but second is the idea, simple idea, but a powerful idea, the global context is changing. What was once thinkable that then became unthinkable is thinkable once more. Now, this thing that's thinkable, how might it start? Again, China's regime newspaper argued, quote, "It's likely that there will be a third world war to fight for sea rights," end quote. That's their official stance. By contrast, in the US, we haven't taken an official stance, but we have, for example, a lot of discussion and things like there's policy journals, like The National Interest, you may have heard of. A lot of policymakers read that. This year, The National Interest wrote an article entitled, quote, "5 ways the US and China could stumble into a war." Now, what's interesting is the editors of National Interest may not believe that people actually read their articles, because then in June, they published a different article that was entitled 3 ways the US and China could go to war. So I don't know if we're up to 8 ways or down to 3 ways, but the bottom line is that wars can start through any number of mechanisms. For example, in history, we had one world war that started through a very deliberate set of choices, and another war that was basically a crisis that spun out of control. The same thing if you're looking forward. You could have a war that starts by miscalculation or accident, 2 warships scraping paint over some reef that isn't even in a nautical chart. Or it could be a choice to, for example, reorder the global system, say in the 2020s, which is when, at least according to the US Navy War College, China's military capability at sea will begin to match the United States, not just in quantity, but also quality. Now, what makes either scenario, accident or choice, more likely is that both military planners and political leaders on both sides assume that if a war began, theirs is the one that would win. And not just that they would win, but that it would be, in the typical phrasings, short and sharp. So they'd win and it would be quick and easy. Indeed, many Chinese military officers have begun to lament out loud that they suffer from a condition that translates as peace disease. This is the terrible condition they describe of never having served in combat before. World War III may seem like a fear of the distant past or a science fiction future, but as the Rolling Stones once sang in Gimme Shelter, it's just a shot away. Now, these dark trends are what led us to try and explore the risks of this brewing 21st century Cold War with China and its junior partner that doesn't want to admit that it's the junior Russia, and what would ever happen if it turned hot. But I'm a defense analyst. I've, as was mentioned, written nonfiction books on topics that range from private military contractors to warlord groups to drones to cybersecurity, another topic I'm very delighted China's helped with my book sales on. But this time, my co-author and I, and he's also from this world, August Cole, he's not a fiction writer. He is, he used to be the defense beat reporter for the Wall Street Journal. He's now at the Atlantic Council. So we're both from the nonfiction space. We're both policy wonks. And yet, we wanted to explore this scenario, and more importantly, the broader future of war. We wrote a novel. Why? Well, the writer Stephen Marsh once said, quote, "Literature is the opposite of data." I actually think he's wrong. I think different. I think fiction can be a powerful tool, and indeed history shows a number of pathways on how it can be a powerful tool, including for a lot of the work that you do here. In fiction, for example, you can dial the timeline forward and explore certain what-ifs and how the world might be different with these what-ifs. So a classic case of this would be H.G. Wells saying, what if you could bundle together radioactive material and create a more powerful explosive than had ever been seen before. Now, the physicists of the day said that's a stupid idea. Radioactive material, it leaches out energy in terms of half-lives of millions of years. It wouldn't work. But a couple of scientists actually were inspired by this idea that he called a, quote, atomic bomb. And they actually were key players in the later Manhattan Project. But the point is not inspiring the bomb, it's exploring the world and war, how it might be different if you had this kind of weapon. And for us, it's not just the what if of exploring the future of war, but just the future world that lies ahead. Everything from what's next with Google Glass to what's the world like when China's ambitious military spending and buildup starts to take more and more fruition. For example, by the year 2030, China's Navy will have 415 warships that will range from 4 aircraft carriers to 99 submarines. What does the balance of power look like in the Pacific then, whether you have a war or not? What is it like to be in the US military serving in that very different world? Fiction, though, cannot just explore a what if, it can warn of a danger that might lie ahead. Probably the best example of this would be a story by Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, who wrote a story in 1914 called Danger. Now, in Danger, Arthur Conan Doyle explored what if Great Britain went to war with an unnamed continental power, and that continental power used this recent science fiction technology of submarines not just to match off against the British fleet of dreadnoughts, but to go after civilian shipping, to carry out a submarine blockade of Great Britain. Now what's interesting is the British Admiralty went public to make fun of Arthur Conan Doyle, this silly fiction writer, for such an absurd idea. Not just that submarines could be effective against battle fleets, but that a nation would choose to so violate the laws of war and use them to carry out unrestricted submarine warfare. In fact, one British admiral wrote how if a submarine captain attacked civilian shipping in this way, their own navy would line them up against a wall and shoot them for such a horrifying idea. As you know your history, that war with the unnamed continental power, Germany, begins. Submarines actually prove to be effective. One of them, for example, sinks 3 pre-dreadnought British battleships in an hour, rewriting everything that they thought they knew about naval warfare and what they planned to do. And of course, they carry out a submarine blockade of Great Britain that very nearly brings it to its knees. Now, this example is an important one because that tactic and the ethics of that tactic using a new technology is not just something that became important in terms of the debate and what happened to Great Britain. It's actually part of the story of why the United States enters World War I and how we become a superpower. That anger over German carrying out unrestricted submarine warfare using this new technology in a way that we found horrifying. And I think there's some parallels, again, to some of the work that you do, for example, in areas of like robotics and what we think is allowable and what's not allowable. But what I find fascinating from history is, again, move the timeline forward. We joined World War I because we find the use of unrestricted submarine warfare horrifying. December 7th, 1941, it takes us 5 hours after the Pearl Harbor attack begins to change our mind about the law and ethics of unrestricted submarine warfare. 5 hours later, the order goes out, commit unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan, and not a single US Navy officer questions it, because we've changed how we think about not just the technology, but also we're in a different kind of war, and we're not doing well at it, and we're pissed off. Fiction can also aid in something else, truth-telling. It can explore topics that are complex, controversial, even, for example, helping us to understand trends that make us uncomfortable. So some of the things that we explore in the book, for example, are everything from will 3D printing do to the current defense marketplace what the iPod did to the music industry? Could ubiquitous sensors and artificial intelligence change the way we think about Boyd's famous observe, orient, decide, act, the OODA loop? What major platforms of today or the planned buys of tomorrow are equivalent to those battleships of yesteryear? how will human performance modification technology affect the human role in war? And finally, because it's uncomfortable because no one wants it to happen, but it's a real risk, what will 21st century state-on-state conflict look like? Fiction can also allow you to hit core human themes, and those can explain the world around you. For example, I'm a World War II history buff, but I would argue that Herman Wouk's books, The Winds of War and War and Remembrance, do a better job of explaining the start and the world and even some of the horrors of World War II than the majority of the actual history books. So too, for example, Admiral Stavridis, the former head of NATO, has described that in trying to figure out Vladimir Putin, he found less useful the SIGINT reports that he was being given and more useful a reading list that had been put together for him of Russian literature novels. Fiction can crystallize, illustrate, bring things together, not just in an understandable manner, but in an emotive manner. So for example, the debate over not just robotics, but robotics being used in war and increasingly autonomous robotics is something, again, that this organization is wrestling with. And it's something that's complex, it's technical, but it's also been reframed around the debate over killer robots. And it's seen a lot of energy and organization where we've seen everything from, I'm aware of at least 3 different task forces within the US Defense Department that are wrestling with these questions of autonomy and what matters or not in war, to you have a United Nations organization on it, to you have a human rights campaign that's brought together 43 different human rights organizations, to you may have seen the news around this letter writing campaign of over 2,000 scientists, some of the leading figures out there, everything from Stephen Hawking to Elon Musk, saying, let's not work on killer robots, let's not work on AI and autonomy as it's applied to war. Now, fiction is driving part of this, killer robots, fears of the Terminator, but also fiction can explore this in different ways. So for example, we wrote a work of fiction, but it documents 21 different examples of how we are already working on autonomous weapon systems and AI in areas that range from AI battle management systems to drones that can take off and land from aircraft carriers to unmanned surface vessels that will hunt submarines on their own. My point of this is that if this campaign that's inspired by fiction that aims to stop this future is going to succeed, it will have to overcome these real-world use cases that are actually being worked on today because of the way we imagine we're going to use this technology in the wars of tomorrow. Finally, distribution. You may or may not be surprised by it, but very powerful people and places that range from the White House to the Pentagon are sometimes more likely to read a novel than they are a memo or even a think tank edited volume. And I can say that working in a think tank. But there was also a selfish motivation for us to scratch a long-standing itch. I grew up reading books like early Tom Clancy. I remember reading Red Storm Rising on the way to the beach. And I wanted to recreate that experience for other readers. As George R.R. Martin, the writer of Game of Thrones, put it, all authors are readers first, and all of us want to write the sort of books we want to read. But as I mentioned again, August and I were policy wonks. So we set out to write a different kind of book. It's a techno-thriller, but it's smashed up with a non-fiction book. Our methodology is that we spent years putting on very different hats. Some of it as novelists, but also some of it, for example, as investigative reporters, gathering information on everything from the next generation of Chinese drones to how certain weapon systems in the US inventory have already been hacked. For example, we're able to document that we know of at least 3 separate occasions on which the Joint Strike Fighter program was breached. Now, sometimes this information you have to dig at, like an investigative reporter. Other times the information is right out there in the open. So for example, sifting through DARPA contract announcements on brain-machine interfaces that are designed to shift moods and shape memories, which again, it inspired us in what seems like science fiction, but we're able to document it as this is something that we're already working on right now. Other times you put on a different kind of hat, hat of an intelligence analyst. So for example, to figure out what warplanes will equip the next generation of Chinese aircraft carriers, we pulled everything from Chinese military reports, military trade shows, to selfies that Chinese citizens took in a harbor with a ship under construction behind them. Then you marry that up with Google Earth. It doesn't tell you you don't know the dimensions of the ship under construction, but you can figure out its dimensions from known objects and then compare. And not just figure out the size of the ship, but things like the size of the elevator on the ship, which then gives you a pretty good indicator of what warplane will be on it 5 years from now versus what will not. Basically banking on the fact that at least their defense industrial system is unlikely to build a ship where a plane can't fit on the elevator, so they're probably going to go with a different system. Now, I joke on that because we've actually just built a warplane where the bombs don't fit inside the bomb bay door. The result is something new. It's a novel, but it's a novel with 400 endnotes. And having these references baked into a novel allows us to establish the facts of a fictional story, but it also allows anyone who ranges from a congressional staffer to a Pentagon officer to a kid to run down more information on whatever it is that catches their fancy. That is, the footnotes document how every single technology in it, every single trend, even some of the things that the characters say, no matter how crazy science fiction, are pulled from the real world. Most of all, by directly connecting the book's facts to open source information, no one can claim that we've leaked classified information. The plots and the battles also followed this idea of bringing together fiction but also nonfiction lessons. A few years earlier, we helped organize a series of non-classified war games for the Pentagon. It was called the Next Tech Project, that basically explored the impact of game-changing technologies in uncomfortable scenarios for the US military. So not the kind of optimal scenarios we often look for, but uncomfortable scenarios. And then we were able to bring together a diverse set of players who range from US military officers to people who'd fought with Hezbollah. And we were basically able to try and explore the what-ifs of not just what technologies will matter, but how conflict actors might use them against each other. I'll give you a spoiler alert. In both fiction and arguably real war, the typical result is not war begins, good guys kick butt exactly according to plan, the end. And yet, notice how so much of our planning kind of assumes that. No matter how high the technology, war is a human story in both the real world and arguably the best fiction. So we met with the real world people who we should expect to fight in such a conflict. They range from US Navy destroyer captains, to Army officers, to US jet fighter pilots, to Chinese generals. But we also set out to meet with the people that we don't, but should expect to play a role in the future of war. So for example, we have this image of the arsenal of democracy and Detroit being the place that generates weapons systems, factories pumping out jeeps and tanks. And yet, if you look at today and the likely future of war, it's very different. So for example, some of the characters in the book that reflect players range from Silicon Valley venture capitalists, which of course we now have the Pentagon doing its outreach to Silicon Valley, to investors gathering in Bentonville, Arkansas, the home of Walmart. And that allows us to play with things like how will these new actors, what will they do in war? not just kind of the Silicon Valley types, but also how will multinational corporations wrestle with the fact that now we have the possibility of wars happening between states where they have business in both of them. So too, the provisions of these companies. Companies don't just make the goods of war, they provide the services of war. And for better, and frankly, a lot for worse, we've grown comfortable with the Blackwaters and the like of the world doing the service side of war in the so-called small wars, but we haven't thought about what role might they play in the big wars, the state-on-state conflicts. So too, the internet was unimaginable the last time states went to war, and yet it connects us all. But it brings in a new array of conflict actors, from the expected types, US Military Cyber Command, to the Chinese Third Department, to ones that will play a role that we should expect. Everything from Chinese university students organized into hacker militia, to non-state hacktivist collectives like Anonymous. We can't predict exactly what they will do, but I think we can predict that they're not going to sit out a conflict in a domain they've sworn to protect. The benefit that you get from this people side is you add flesh, not just to the fiction side of the story, but also the nonfiction lessons you could pull from it. So, for example, I remember meeting with a fighter pilot about a fifth-generation dogfight. What might happen when you see fifth-gen jets coming together? What move might you pull if you had a Chinese J-31 on your tail? But also we talked about them with things like, how will you feel about the idea that there might be drones flying in the air alongside you? This is important because that how would you feel connects to something really interesting. That scenario of manned and unmanned planes flying in the same airspace is actually part of the Air Force's strategic plan. But how pilots feel about it is why the Air Force has had such a hard time implementing its own strategic plan. Now, the structure of the book is a lot like the books that we enjoyed reading that I've already mentioned, things like Red Storm Rising or Game of Thrones, where it doesn't follow a single character on a single journey like a typical novel, but instead multiple characters in multiple locations, sometimes ones that never even meet each other. Now, this allows us, it's the kind of books we like. It allows you to treat the war itself as a character, to experience it from different vantage points. But here also, there's a very important nonfiction concept to pull out from it. It lays out how conflict in the 21st century, particularly conflict involving states, will be very different from the so-called small wars. I hate that term, but it's one that's out there. The small wars that we've grown accustomed to fighting and many adversaries think reveal a new American weakness. First of all, it would be multi-domain. Unlike the Taliban or even Saddam's Iraq, great powers can and will fight across every domain. So, for example, the last time the United States Navy fought a pier at sea was over 70 years ago. The last time the United States Army Air Corps fought a pier in the air was more than 70 years ago. For ground forces, the last time American forces were bombed by a foreign air force, it's actually more than 40 years ago. It's a little known story. Some people will say, no, that's Korea. Actually, it's a little known story from the Vietnam War, where an American outpost in Laos, that's why we don't talk about it, was bombed by 3 North Vietnamese propeller-driven cargo planes. Whereupon a Air America, a CIA contractor Huey helicopter, took off, chased down the North Vietnamese cargo planes, and shot them down with a combination of a door gunner using an AK-47 and then the pilot using the prop wash from his Huey to force down the North Vietnamese propeller planes. That's the last time we had to think about air defense and being actually bombed by another side. But it's not just those spaces, it's also new spaces. Back in 1945, for example, the concepts of satellites was merely a vision of a young scientist named Arthur C. Clarke. You may remember better as a science fiction author. Since then, we use space. We put thousands of satellites up into space, and we use them for everything from command and control to intelligence gathering. If we saw a conflict, we would see conflict in space. Both the US, Russia, China, we've all been working on various space warfare plans. Similarly, we'd learn that cyber war is a lot different from how we talk about it. It's different from stealing the script of James Bond's next movie from a movie theater studio chain to stealing your and my security clearance documents. It's more likely to be going after the nervous system of militaries themselves and actually causing kinetic change through Stuxnet-style digital weaponry. And worrisome for the US is last year the Pentagon's weapons tester found that every single major US weapons program had, in their words, significant vulnerabilities to cyber attack. That's what we found, as opposed to things we later learned about, like the OPM breach. A multi-domain fight and involving state powers would also require a total mind shift in, for example, what we buy and how we use it. Our defense acquisition system has specialized in buying the Pontiac Aztecs of war. Now, Pontiac Aztec, if you remember it, it came out in 2001. It was sports car in the front, minivan in the middle, SUV in the back. Tried to be all things to all people. It turned out to be instead overpromised, over-engineered, overpriced. Now, the funny thing is when I talk to military audiences, they all think I'm talking about a certain system, but whatever service they're from is the one they think of. So if you meet with a Navy audience, they think, oh, Pontiac Aztec, it's X, as opposed to an Air Force audience, they think, oh, he's talking about Y. What I'm getting at is we have this pattern across the system. So General McMaster brought me in to not just sell books, but to push a little. So I'm actually going to name names. We, for example, are right now in the midst of buying a jet fighter that has less range than its World War II equivalent 3 generations back and was bested in a dogfight by a plane 40 years older than it. We're in the midst of buying a tanker aircraft which is only planned to be able to be protected up to a, quote, medium threat environment, at the very moment when we face adversaries that are developing long-range reach, not just in terms of air-to-air, but also going after our bases. At sea, we are embarking on a buying program for a warship that the Navy's own tester found, quote, is not expected to be survivable in high-intensity combat. So in the book, we explore the implications of this fingers crossed plan. What is it like to be the pilot of a plane that's not designed to be in a dogfight, or that's called upon to do close air support? It's not going to be reassuring that leaders back in 2015 said, but don't worry, that'll never ever happen. What is it like if an adversary doesn't play by our plans and instead of keeping the conflict at a medium threat level, raises it to a high threat level? What is it like to be the captain of a warship that gets into a battle when your ship is, quote, not expected to be survivable in that kind of battle? Now, fortunately, it's a novel, so none of these things could ever happen. This is not just about the potential of a high-intensity fight. It's also about another shift that's happening out there, a new kind of race. It's basically been about 70 years since US forces were matched, or even more importantly, overmatched in terms of the technology that we could bring to bear into battle. You have to go back to World War II and the German so-called wonder weapons that ranged from long-range missiles to the first jet fighters to the first automatic rifles, to tanks that were essentially a generation ahead better than anything that we had. That's the last time we went through that kind of experience. Since then, the idea that we would be able to overmatch in terms of capability and technology our foes has become baked into everything from our overall defense strategy all the way down to small unit tactics. So it was, for example, the idea behind how we would deter the Soviet Red Army with a much smaller force, or how we were able to invade another nation in 2001 and then again in 2003, where the typical 3-to-1 defender-attacker ratio was flipped on its head, essentially, because of this capability, because of this overmatch. All the way down to our expectations in a small unit fight. I remember speaking with a Marine officer about how if his unit in Afghanistan of roughly 30 men was attacked by a Taliban unit of 100. And he described that he wouldn't have any fear that they would lose. And that weirdly there'd almost be in the back of his head this kind of sense of relief that finally they were getting the kind of stand-up fight that they'd been looking for, rather than always having to go out and hunt or deal with ambushes or IEDs. There was no kind of fear of a loss. Again, put that in comparison. If you'd asked a officer in 1943, your unit of 30 infantry is going to be attacked by 100 Panzer Grenadiers, or your unit of 30 Marines is going to be attacked by 100 Japanese naval infantry. You have a very different approach, a very different thought process. It's become baked in. The challenge, though, is looking forward. Even today, that overmatch is fleeting. It's not just that many of our major platforms are vulnerable to new classes of weapons, and that's everything from aircraft carriers to tanks, that are in more and more actors' hands, but it's also things like, for example, China just overtook the European Union in overall research and development spending, and is on pace to pass the United States within 5 years. They have new projects that range from supercomputers. So for example, about 2 weeks ago, the US Army put out a news article about the new US Army supercomputer, Excalibur. Incredible system. It's the 18th fastest supercomputer in the world. Where are the fastest ones? China. Or to drone programs. China has 3 different long-range drone strike programs. But it's not just the idea of a new state competitor, it's about a shift in the marketplace itself, where a series of now off-the-shelf technologies are allowing capability that rivals and sometimes even surpasses the most advanced tools in our hands. So for example, the winner of a recent robotics test sponsored by the Pentagon was not a defense contractor, but was a group of South Korean student engineers. This points to another shift that's out there that I've been touching on again and again, is the idea of how you will have a wide array of what had recently been science fiction technologies making their way into this battle space and being used by the various players, ranging from drones to more autonomous drones, to AI battle management systems, to electromagnetic railguns, you name it. But unlike the ISISes of the world, great powers can not just use the technology, but they can go after technology's new vulnerabilities, such as by hacking them, or knocking down GPS, conducting electronic warfare. So for example, a future war may see things like ground robotics on the cover of the ship is the USS Zumwalt, this stealthy battleship that's being built in Maine right now. It's powered by over 4 million lines of software code. We may see that, but we'll also see things like cyber warfare and potentially the knockdown or disruption of GPS. So as one Marine officer put it, battles in the 21st century will be confusing and disorganized affairs more similar to the clashes of a pre-digital age. The idea being you may have stealth battleships, you may have robots, but you'll also have things like, how do I figure out where the enemy is? How do I figure out where I am? And again, put this into counterpoint. I meet and speak with a lot of different U.S. military audiences, and one of the things, a common complaint, is information overload. And the metaphor that's constantly used is there's so much data coming in, there's so much information coming in, it feels like I'm sipping from a fire hose. I've heard that metaphor countless times. And we've developed all sorts of different systems to deal with that sipping from a fire hose phenomenon. What happens when the spigots turn off? That's a very different approach. And again, it's not just how we deal with it technologically, but just simply mentally. The point is, and hopefully this will particularly warm General McMaster's heart, in future wars, we should expect what we've seen in past wars. High technology, but also low technology. Crazy new capabilities, but also the old lessons of war holding true. We used fiction to highlight Clausewitz's lesson that the outcomes of war are uncertain because they're clashes of wills between thinking opponents. I could go on, but again, another difference of fiction and nonfiction is I don't want to ruin the book for you. So I'll end by saying it's actually opportunities like this that have been one of the more unexpected and just incredibly powerful at a personal level experiences coming out of the book project. And that while many people have described it as a work of fiction, I don't see it as that, and I certainly don't hope it's that. I hope in many ways it can be a work of prevention. That is, by exploring this world, by identifying things that we're doing that maybe we ought not to, or things that we ought to do, we can help shape the future world that lies ahead, and therefore keep the next world war in the place where it belongs, in the realm of fiction. Thank you. So I think we've got time for Q&A.
Yeah, we do. I think we'll go for about 45 minutes, if that's okay with you.
I'm at your disposal.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Back there, yeah. And if you could please introduce yourself as well.
Yes, sir. Dan Sookman, straight out in Joint Forces Staff College. My question is, in the book, you brought in a lot of the ideas from your previous nonfiction works, Corporate Warriors, Wired for War. Given the scenario it did, I'm interested in your thoughts from your work of children at war. And would you ever see the United States lowering its morale using children to fight in a scenario where the desperation might be there? Thank you.
Yeah. Again, this is one of these areas where the reality of present-day war sometimes is not matched in our visualizations of it or our planning for it. And that was what motivated me on this book, Children at War, that came out in 2005, where, you know, essentially if you did a poll or a survey of all the people in the world fighting in wars, at that time, roughly 10% of them would have been children. And in specific, there were all sorts of places where we were deploying where children were part of either an allied, which made it really awkward, or an adversary, or a potential adversary. And it was everything from in Afghanistan to if you were doing an embassy evacuation in West Africa, to you were doing a partnership capacity building effort in East Africa. And so the point was it was there, and yet there was, we weren't kind of incorporating in how we visualize war, how we think about it. It's still there. The numbers have gone down slightly. It's less than 10%, but it's still there. I would suggest for folks, again, in this space of fiction and nonfiction, there's a new movie out called Beasts of No Nation that's really worth seeing. It's set in Africa, kind of a civil war in Africa, and it follows the story of a young man, and it kind of is it's artfully done depiction of, gives you an explanation of warlordism, not just child soldiering. But so, would we ever use children? First, it actually has happened in our history. So everything from if you drive, if you take, you leave DC and take 66 west, you'll go past Newmarket, where the Battle of Newmarket, the Confederacy deployed young cadets from VMI. And we say young cadets, not 17-and-a-half-year-olds, but roughly in the ranges of like 12 to 14 years old. They're celebrated in the museum there because they helped turn the tide of battle. There was recently an article in, I believe it was Army Magazine, about this great story of a young Union Army soldier who shot a Confederate colonel, I believe it was in the Battle of the Wilderness. So we've done it before. But the patterns of why you turn to children is typically because you lack manpower or you can't persuade the adults to join. That's the pattern throughout history. And they can't persuade the adults to join is often because the war is unpopular. Or for warlords, it's like, come fight for me and help me seize a diamond mine. That's not a persuasive thing. But kids you can abduct or trick into doing things. Same thing, you know, Confederacy turned to kids because it was running out of manpower. That's the example in turn of when we fought in state-on-state conflict. The Hitler Youth were deployed by the Nazis towards the end of the war because they were running out of manpower. I have a tough time visualizing that for us as a formal military. I think you could do kind of a, you know, if you want to play in the realm of fiction and nonfiction, some kind of discourse over like cyber warfare and, you know, like an Ender's Game story, and do we turn to kids because they've got better skill sets? I don't know. I mean, short answer, I don't see it happening. What I will say, to use that as a bridge, because I know there's a lot of folks here who work on everything from organization to plans, including related to cyber, is in that space we're going to have to revisualize who we think of as a cyber warfare and stop trying to take a new problem and new people and put them into old boxes. So we've created some very important, useful units, U.S. Army Cyber Command or Navy 10th Fleet. We've also created organizations within the National Guard and Reserve for this that are very valuable at it. But as a nation, we've not tapped the wider pool of talent of people who are either unwilling or, for example, physically unable to serve in either active duty or National Guard, which when you're talking about hackers, that's a pretty big pool. And we've not done it. And I've put out there the idea that we should create the equivalent of Estonia's Cyber Defense League, which is the best way to think of it is it's like a militia model or like a Civil Air Patrol here, where in Civil Air Patrol you're a volunteer, you do it because you want to learn and you love aviation, but then you can also you're eligible to like help on everything from training to emergency response. Estonia has a cyber equivalent of that. We don't, and I think we could benefit from it. Or a different example would be the federal government created the digital service in response to the healthcare.gov problem. That was when, you know, the website didn't work. They contracted out to a bunch of big contractors. It didn't work. So they reached out to Silicon Valley and brought in a small number of people who fixed the website, and they didn't. That's the start of the digital service, and it's this means for people who are basically kind of younger experts to help the federal government, but I don't want to be an SES. I just want to come in for the year and do it. We've created that for innovation. After the OPM, why did we not create something like that for cybersecurity? So there's kind of new organizational spaces that I think we could tap if we're willing to break outside of old boxes. Yes, right there.
How you doing? Joe Bretcher, Treyarch Arctic. Thank you.
I think you touched on it in the book, but I haven't fully read the book yet. Promise I will.
That's better than you saying I started it and put it down. I didn't like it.
So far, I love it. Policies and authorities as we explore future technologies, autonomous systems, et cetera. You touched on it a little bit. Reaching back into industrial age mines and submunitions and the policies and the authorities that come into play, and then future again, to autonomous systems and quote-unquote killer robots. How do you see that playing out as our adversaries pay less attention to those issues, are less concerned with those issues, and yet they become major overmatch considerations potentially in the future?
It's a great question, and it comes in, you can approach it from so many different levels. So there is, the direct answer is the problem of what's been called, Charlie Dunlap coined the term of lawfare. The idea that my adversary is not ignorant of the laws of war, they actually know the laws of war and are deliberately taking advantage of them. They're exploiting them to their own advantage. So I know I'm not supposed to attack something with a red cross or red crescent on it. That's why I'm using an ambulance to move weaponry back and forth. Or I know that civilians are not supposed to be shot at. That's exactly why I'm doing my ethnic cleansing with a tank with a bunch of kids riding on the top of it. These are both, real-world examples, and they're examples though from the 1990s. So this is not new. We've been wrestling with this for we're multiple decades now. It is just simply the reality of the battle space. I would argue though, sometimes you hear people say that as like an excuse for why we don't do well or could we do the same. And I would just point out in history, the reason why there are the laws of war and why we follow the laws of war is not just merely your own sense of professionalism, your own sense of ethics, the kind of the visual, good guys follow the laws, but also in history, consistently in clashes between professionals who follow a code and barbarians who don't. In the grand span of history, professionals tend to win more often. So there's something about having that code, and then we can dig into the why of it, and it's everything from your organization to winning locals' hearts and minds, whatever. That's kind of the direct lawfare side of this. I wanted to hit a different part of the command and control part that you began with, which is the complexities of when you start talking about cyber warfare, when you start talking about increasingly automated systems, when you start talking about just simply more sensors and network communications, what we have now is the ability of something that generals or flag officers and politicians have always wanted to have. They've always wanted to not just see what's going on in battle, but affect it, to make the decision. And the problem, the challenge of that is that I'm sure a lot of you have heard the phraseology of the strategic corporal, the idea that the younger troops are making greater consequential decisions. The strategic corporal has an evil twin, the tactical general. And the tactical general or the tactical politician is the idea that someone either thousands of miles away or days or months before can make the most minute tactical decision, either by telling someone what to do, shoot at that target, don't shoot at that target. And this is not a mythical made-up thing. In Wired for War, for example, I talked about the example of an Army Ranger talking about being in a mission where he's got in his ear and a one-star is basically telling him, oh, go around that corner, go this way, go that way. They're watching in the talk and trying to tell him where to go. To this is the discourse over we complained about, oh, LBJ tried to shape the air offensive. LBJ didn't get down into, you can hit that target, but not that target, which we're able to do right now. And so the point of this is that on one hand, it's a positive because of the huge political impact of minute decisions, particularly in these kind of wars of today. Why shouldn't the senior leader be making that decision? There's a double problem, I would argue. One is often the senior leader is not trained to make that decision, whether they are a civilian or sometimes in uniform. So, well, I'll just leave it at that. The second is every minute that they spend playing tactical level, they're not dealing with the big strategic. It's addictive, but it pulls them away from the big picture decisions. And third, they're robbing all the people in between of that decision experience for when they're in that role. And so when we think about kind of the, what you brought up, there's also kind of the location of command and control, and who can do what is shifting, and it's having very different consequences. Yeah.
Brad Herndon, I'm the local industry guy with the Association of the U.S. Army. Most of the threats that we're kind of discussing here, except for cyber, are essentially conventional, exquisite type weapons. And there's somebody in this room that likes to say there's two ways to fight the U.S. Army, asymmetrically and stupid. Have you thought of any, or do you envision any asymmetric counters that kind of go with or against these threats that we're talking about?
Oh, absolutely. And in the book, we come at it in a couple of ways. The first is, so one of the storylines is essentially an insurgency. And it's an insurgency where the professional, the occupying force, uses all of the technologies that we have today and are planning to have tomorrow. For example, Gorgon Stare, right? A drone that's able to monitor lots of different targets at once, to checkpoints with rapid DNA identification, like what the Rapid Equipping Cell rolled out for our forces. That occupying force also has the same debates that we have today, or we've been having for the last 10 years on, at the end of the day, is it about hearts and minds, or is it about high-value target disrupting networks? We flipped the script, though, in that actually it's the U.S. forces that are on the insurgency side. And the U.S. forces are using the tricks of the trade that they've developed themselves, but they've also picked up along the way, mostly low tech, but sometimes high, mostly low tech, from the wars that we've been fighting. And this was, again, not just kind of us dreaming it up, but from meetings with particularly folks within the special operations community on, what have you learned from the Taliban or whatnot? Not that you admire them, but what are like the tools that you've got in your rucksack that you might pull out? And again, the lesson of it is not exquisite always wins the day. It's that there are workarounds, and those workarounds might be ways of tricking, infrared sensor technology, misdirection, to his last question, fighting lawfare on your side. So there's that. The second point that I put out there, and it's something that I think, again, applies in whatever level of war, is we need to expand our definition of asymmetric warfare. We've thought of asymmetric warfare primarily as someone's going after my weaknesses. They're not fighting us head-to-head, they're going after our supply lines, they're not going after the tank, they're going after the soft-skin vehicle, whatever it is, it's going against the weakness. That's how we talk about asymmetric warfare. If you look at both current but also kind of historic Chinese military discourse, instead it's a different definition of asymmetry or asymmetric warfare. It's what we call assassin's mace. And assassin's mace was a physical tool which was basically someone has a long sword. Rather than me doing a long sword against you, I carry a mace under my sleeve and I smash the sword. This approach is saying, I'm not going after your weaknesses, I'm turning your strengths into weaknesses. It's a very different. And essentially, we've been studied, and the strengths that we have are, in particular, that makes us unique from anyone else, is this incredibly networked system that applies to everything from command and control to intelligence gathering. It allows us synchronous operation. And then the second thing is our global logistics and basing. and basing also including aircraft carriers. And if you look at what, for example, China, but also other potential adversaries, and not just in an air, sea, but also land approach, is they will go after those two strengths rather than just merely our weaknesses and potentially turn them into weaknesses. That's why I think it's interesting what the Naval Academy has done, where they've created both the first cybersecurity major that's feeding people into 10th Fleet, but they've also required every midshipman now learn celestial navigation for when the technology inevitably craps out.
Rob Dillon, Human Dimension Division, ARCIC. Thank you for being here, Dr. Singer. To keep going on with, we were talking about exquisite weapon systems and using strategy a little less, ends, ways, and means. We'll leave ends off, but we've been talking about means. Tank to tank, technology to technology. I was wondering if you could talk about how you see the ways of war, specifically as two geopolitical near-peer powers are in conflict, a Western way of thinking things, our cultural outlook, and an Eastern way of seeing things, i.e. Sun Tzu versus some other philosophy. And would that be decisive or give us a competitive advantage or them a competitive advantage?
Great question on lots of different ways. So one of the reasons that we chose the World War III scenario, one, that was, I loved Red Storm Rising, I wanted, that kind of book. Second was the belief that, and again, you have to go back in time, the book's out now, but it was 4 years back when it was being built and sold. And back then, everything was Middle East, everything was insurgency. It's less shocking to say things now, but it was against it. But even, to the fiction publishers, they're looking at like all the books in the fiction novels, they link to, it's always like a terrorism hunt or something like that. And so it's a little bit counterintuitive. We wanted to go at that. But the third is the idea of the stakes. And that if you weren't going to, what would we or would we not change when the stakes are so high? When it's not a war of discretion or decision, but it's one that is the kind of existential level or grand level for the nation. How would that be different? What would we change? What would we not change? And then in turn, it allows you to make the argument back. Are you going to wait for this level of threat or loss to change what you're doing? And that's where we've seen some impact of the book in the real world on certain programs that have changed because of people reading the possibilities and or the perils and saying we don't need to let it happen. We should change this regardless. So you got that stakes. The second part of your question though related to kind of the different approaches of Eastern versus Western, again you can use both the activities but also the characters to play that out. So as opposed to when you meet with a jet fighter pilot and say, what move would you pull if a J-31 was on your tail? You're in action with a Chinese general. They're not going to give you that kind of information. So instead, the things that we were picking up from that were what historic references are they peppering their speech with? What quotes are they making? And so at the center of it, and it's not a cliche, the incredibly central role of Sun Tzu. And that's everything from how people talk to, if you read Chinese military documents, to the quote on the wall of the Chinese National Defense Library, National Defense University Library is Sun Tzu. And so it's there, it's a powerful force. It's kind of comparable to how your community, uses phrases like fog of war and friction, trinity, ends ways, pulling from Clausewitz. So it's there. And there's very different approaches in what that means, and everything from indirect versus direct approaches, linear approaches, etc. One thing that I would point out that's very interesting is I think it'll reshape, and this is the cross with cyber warfare, how we think about the phases of war and how we will redefine certain trusted concepts. So Sun Tzu, one of his great quotes, and I'm going to mangle it right now, was basically the idea that sort of the greatest things to be able to pull off, the highest level of skill, is to win a battle without fighting. And in the book, he's talking about things essentially about seizing high ground or putting yourself across an enemy's line of supply where you kind of give them no other choice. And the classic Western example of this is probably Napoleon at Austerlitz. Kind of masterful maneuvering where you put the enemy in a position where they just can't win. That's how we think about the winning without a fight. Crossing with cyber and electronic warfare, we may see things where, for example, the fight that matters happens in phase 0, before the war has begun. Now, we talk about phase 0 as things like building partnership capacity, winning hearts and minds, all that kind of stuff. I'm talking about the idea that, for example, the Ukrainians had lost their cyber war before the war began, because basically the Russians owned both figuratively and actually their networks. So the battle had already been lost. Or if you're thinking about the battles that might matter in, you know, a World War III in cyber warfare, for us, it's the cyber Pearl Harbor, cyber 9, whatever the scenario is. The action may start on the day of the war, but the actual attack will have begun months or years beforehand. So for example, the average date that a victim becomes aware that they're under cyber attack is 205 days after the cyber attack began. So what I'm getting is kind of the Eastern-Western. There's also the kind of the redefinition of core concepts in those. The same though for our concepts. The fog of war, you know, it's the fog created by gunpowder, but Clausewitz is using it to talk about how it's just, you know, the idea of the unexpected friction and misinformation and just not knowing what's going on in battle. Clausewitz was never thinking about a deliberate fog created by your adversary. The idea of, you know, if someone changed your GPS coordinates, that's creating a fog of war. But that's a deliberate creation of a fog of war. But the phrase still is powerful, it's just powerful in a very different meaning.
We have one more question.
Yeah. Todd Roy, I'm attending Joint Advanced Warfighting School at the JFSC. And my question is, while we try and maintain our technological lead, and granted it's narrowing, but how do we keep our allies on board? Because in contrast to Russia or China, one of our strengths is our partnership with our allied nations, and we could potentially outstrip their military capabilities to interoperate with us.
Great question, and again, I think we can come at it on a number of levels. The first is, now I'll again be challenging in this space, not to assume that alliances and interests that were created in the 20th century will play out the exact same way in the 21st century. Period. And that means where there are pressure points where old alliances may not bear fruit, new alliances may matter more. That's not a very politic thing to say, but I think it's a reality. And so you need to wrestle with that. Second, to your more specific point, is about kind of the interoperability and meshing of when the two sides say, yes, we're both in this fight, we have an interest. How do you ensure that they can operate well together? I think a lot of the work that's being done by organizations like this point to the ways to do it, and it's everything from making sure your systems can communicate to making sure that your people can communicate. And what I would get at is this, is that interoperability as a phrase, as a term, is often abused as that's exactly why you need to buy the same gear as me. And we say it's because of interoperability, but underneath it, it's also things like, because I want to keep my per unit costs down, so the more you buy of it, the better. Interoperability is not merely about the technology. It's often more about the people. So I will use an air example. What air forces are we most interoperable with? It's probably the British Royal Air Force, the Australian Air Force, etc. The Royal Air Force, for the most part, does not fly American jets right now. In turn, who flies American jets? Nations like in the GCC. And yet, when it came time for like Libya, we didn't seamlessly work together. We said, you stay over here, I'll stay over there. We oversell, and the reason why there's interoperability is because it's not just things like sharing of digital information. It's things like the people spoke the same language, and I don't mean English. I mean they spoke the same doctrinal language. They had experiences together that led to personal trust between them. They understood each other, and so I think we sometimes oversell that interoperability will come out of just buying the same gear when, frankly, it won't. And then I'm going to throw another kind of thing out there. Sometimes it's even worse for us from a strategic standpoint when they buy that gear because there may be a mismatch. So, for example, yes, someone else buys a certain weapon system, it drives the per unit cost down, but is that actually what we want out of that ally? So do we want that ally? Are we going to be calling upon that ally to be doing air strike or air-to-air defense? But yet we push them down one alleyway because we'll keep the cost down. I mean, we could go on, but just interoperability is a term that's abused, and the people side of it is what matters most, whether it's the alliance interests or the personal relationships or the language, you name it. So again, I think that's the time we have for the last one. So I just want to again express my appreciation for being able to join you and for all of you coming. Thank you.
I just want to say, on behalf of everybody, thank you so much for just tremendous insights. Your conclusion that at the end of your talk, where you said, you're trying to prevent us really from having difficulties in the future, I think it's reminiscent of when Ray Bradbury wrote Fahrenheit 451. He was asked by an interviewer. He said, "Hey, are you trying to predict the future?" He said, "Hell no, I'm trying to prevent the future. Prevent this future vision." And I think you've helped us tremendously to do that. And that's our job here. Is to think clearly about the problem of future war and to make sure that we are in the best possible position against our future enemies and are able to secure our nation. And so Kelly, could you bring that up here? So I'd like to give you a small token of our appreciation. This is a book that describes really our Army in photos and in history. And I know I speak for all of us where we say we deeply appreciate your visit here today, but the great body of work you've given us as well. Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, just a couple admin notes before Gentleman Master closes out. First of all, just a quick thanks to all for coming. And I especially want to thank partners who showed up today. A special thanks to our members from the NATO Allied Command Transformation.
Just raise your hands for each of these units. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we've got a couple members from Air Combat Command as well. We've got a pretty strong contingent from the Joint Advanced Warfighting School. And another strong contingent from the CSA's Strategic Studies Group right over here. For all of the partners, please stay and come and join us in the reception this afternoon. Reception, I'd like to thank Brad Herndon and Bob Bridgeford from AUSA for sponsoring the reception that's going to happen here very shortly. AUSA. Unfortunately, we have sold out of all the books we brought today, so we appreciate your purchases. But Dr. Singer has graciously agreed to do some book signings afterwards. There's always Amazon. Please go on and buy more and more and more. And they will have more over in clothing sales shortly. So if you'd like to get the book signed, please join Dr. Singer in the library, in the lobby afterwards. Otherwise, please join us for the reception by AUSA. And sir, I'll hand it back to you.
Okay, thanks. Kelly, I'm going to let you take Dr. Singer out so we can get pre-positioned back there. Escort you. And hey, so for our team, I just want to say, just because I've got an opportunity to do this on a Friday afternoon, to say thank you for the great work that you're doing. I think what Dr. Singer really emphasized for us at TRADOC and all across TRADOC is how important our jobs are. And we've got to work on our problem sets as a joint multinational team, so I really appreciate our partners being here. And so essentially what we're trying to do is really 4 things, right? We have to make sure we think clearly about the problem of future armed conflict. Dr. Singer has helped us do that, right, by imagining the future so we can understand our present and the decisions we have to make and how we have to think about the problem of future armed conflict. We have to learn on a continuous basis through the framework of the warfighting challenges and in our learning venues, Force 2025 maneuvers, as well as joint experimentation and wargaming and our multinational exercises. We have to analyze what we learn so we understand, hey, what are the priorities we have to go after, right? We know we have better harden our communications networks. We better take into consideration the need to defend, our hardware, every weapon system, from these kind of disruptive threats that we see already on display in eastern Ukraine, for example. So we have to analyze what we're learning and tee up really what our top priorities are, and then we have to implement it. We have to get it done. We have to drive it. So all of you are playing, I think, an extremely important role in making our Army and our armed forces, our joint force, better every day, and I really appreciate it. Thanks so much, and please introduce yourselves to our guests during the reception, and have a great, great weekend. Thank you.